Welcome to Baraboo 101, Part 2, From Dams to Downtown. If you missed Baraboo 101 Part 1, you can find it at the Sauk County Historical Society YouTube channel, along with nearly 60 other videos on local history. While you're there, would you please subscribe? The Sauk County Historical Society website is rich with historical resources as well as information on upcoming events. Visit us at saukcountyhistory.org. Be sure to click on the Education tab on our website where you will find curriculum resources for grades 3 through 12. If you aren't subscribed to the Sauk County Historical Society e-news, you can do so at our website. This twice-monthly email is complete with local history articles, pictures, and information on upcoming events. You can also find the Sauk County Historical Society on Facebook. Please join our public group. If you missed Baraboo 101 Part 1, we learned how the current name for the river came from a French-Canadian fur trader named Francois Barbeau. We also learned that the stretch of river that runs through the city of Baraboo today is unique along the entire length of the river. The river drops about 45 feet through the city of Baraboo and has shallow rapids. This made for easy places to cross the river, and it was also a great place to harvest fish. There are also two large oxbows in this stretch of river on either end of the city. We learn that people have been living along this stretch of the river for thousands of years, as evidenced by the mounds that were once here. Some of the ancestors of the mound builders are the Ho-Chunk, who also had villages here along this stretch of river. When this area was claimed by the United States after the Revolutionary War, the area shifted from fur trading to mining and logging, and ultimately settlement by Americans and Europeans. A series of treaties with the Ho-Chunk and other tribes led to the Wisconsin and Fox Rivers becoming a dividing line in the 1830s between Euro-American settlement and tribal lands. In 1837, a Ho-Chunk delegation was forced into signing a treaty, officially ceding their rights to all lands east of the Mississippi, at least in the eyes of the federal government. On June 5, 1838, the Senate ratified the treaty with the Ho-Chunk. The dividing line of the Wisconsin and Fox Rivers was no more, soon catching the interests of Euro-Americans. Barry Haney, living in Dane County, received news from a territorial delegate in Congress that the treaty with the Ho-Chunk had been ratified. Haney marked out the first claim across the Wisconsin River in what is now Sauk City. Haney employed 2 men to break 10 acres of ground and construct a crude dwelling. The men dug a pit 4 feet deep and 12 by 18 feet, logged it up, and covered the hole with hay and earth, making sort of a sod house. Other Euro-Americans slowly trickled onto the Sauk Prairie. On the 4th of July in 1839, 25 settlers at what would become Prairie du Sac celebrated. Only 4 of them were women. In the summer of 1839, James Albin, who was the first Euro-American settler out on the Sauk Prairie, told Eben Peck in Madison about his trip over the bluff to the north, where he encountered a lake and saw the Baraboo River Valley beyond. Eben Peck and his wife Rosalind were both born in Vermont. They moved to New York State before coming to southern Wisconsin in 1836. They were the first Yankee family to settle in the new territorial capital of Madison, where they constructed a large log house which was used by early politicians, judges, and lawyers. Peck and Alvin soon left to explore the Baraboo River Valley. They crossed the bluffs and came to the Baraboo River at a point near the lower Oxbow. They crossed the river and encountered the Ho-Chunk at the Karamani village. The Ho-Chunk demonstrated their displeasure at their arrival. Despite this, Peck decided to claim the land around the lower Oxbow. Later that fall, Eben Peck traveled back to the area with his wife Rosalind Peck and his brother Luther to see the claim. Rosalind Peck was the first Yankee woman to see the Baraboo River Valley, and she became influential in the community. There is a street named after her today. While riding back towards Portage, the Pecks met Wallace Rowan and Abe Wood, who were also on their way to look at the Baraboo River Valley. Abe Wood was married to Sarah, who was part Ho-Chunk, which definitely helped him when interacting with the Ho-Chunk. About a month after Peck made his claim, Chester Matson and James Van Slyke visited the Baraboo Rapids in search of a mill power and concluded to jump Peck's claim. Van Slyke returned to Walworth County and convinced James Maxwell to back him and become a half partner by supplying the means, with Van Slyke supplying the labor. The winter of 1839-40 was reported to be very severe. Despite this, Abe Wood built a cabin on a hill above the upper Oxbow of the river in what is today Oxnard Park. This was the first settler cabin built along the Baraboo River. Today, the site is marked by a stone monument and marker showing the spot where Abe Wood's cabin once stood. That winter, Wood and Rowan commenced work on their dam located just below Wood's cabin on the east side of the upper Oxbow. Meanwhile, back on the Sauk Prairie, settlers there were anxious to start county government, so the territorial legislature was petitioned to set off a new county. On January 10, 1840, an act to establish the county of Sauk was approved by the Wisconsin territorial legislature, and Sauk County was laid out geographically. Slightly larger originally, the western border of the county would later be changed when Richland County was established. The 1840 federal census recorded that Sauk County had a total population of 102 people living in 20 households. This number did not include indigenous people. The largest group of individuals enumerated was 20 to 30-year-old males. Most people lived on the Sauk Prairie, with just a handful in the Baraboo Valley. Later that year, Prairie du Sac was platted as the first settlement in Sauk County. In the early spring of 1840, Maxwell furnished Van Slyke with 2 yoke of oxen, chains, and a wagon, a set of sawmill irons, pork, flour, and beans. Van Slyke left for the Baraboo Valley with 4 or 5 hired men. Van Slyke had the log dam at the lower Oxbow just about ready for graveling when Peck served papers against Van Slyke and Company, and they were summoned to Madison, where Peck eventually won the suit. In June, in what might be considered highly ironic, flooding destroyed the dam that Maxwell and Van Slyke were building, and Maxwell decided to sell the mill irons, or basically the machinery for a sawmill, to Rowan and Wood, who installed them at the Upper Oxbow, thus making theirs the first dam and sawmill on the Baraboo River. With increased settlement in places like Sauk County, forced removal of the Ho-Chunk began in May of 1840. The Ho-Chunk were to be deported to lands west of the Mississippi by federal troops. Chief Yellow Thunder and his wife Washington Woman were lured to Fort Winnebago under false pretenses and were then imprisoned until Yellow Thunder agreed to bring in his band of Ho-Chunk to the fort for deportation within 3 days. Yellow Thunder complied, and he and his wife were deported along with others for the first of several times. Each time, many walked back hundreds of miles to their homelands. During the winter of 1840 to 41, Archibald Barker, an Irish immigrant, cut timber on Seeley Creek and was the first ever to run logs down the Baraboo River the following spring. Barker had his logs sawn at Wood and Rowan's sawmill and built a raft of 10,000 board feet of lumber. The rough sawn lumber was assembled into cribs or square units. When fully assembled, the raft was 110 feet long. Barker ran the cribs down the river with Ed Kingsley, and when they got to the lower end of the rapids, they came across something remarkable. Barker would later recall, "In running down the cribs to the lower end of the rapids, where we coupled up, one day in company with Ed Kingsley, going down each on a crib, I hallooed to him to look and see that somebody seemed to have made a dam of stones across the river. As we approached, we saw it was the backs and tails of fishes. We soon were amongst them and found they were sturgeons. I killed 3 of them with my handspike. In jumping into the water to get them, I was knocked down by their running against my legs. For a short distance the river seemed to be jammed full of them." Barker continued his journey down the circuitous Baraboo River until he reached the Wisconsin River and sold his lumber at Decorah. As hard as navigating the Baraboo River was, getting to Baraboo by land was even harder. There were no roads, but there were paths used for centuries by indigenous people and animals. In February of 1841, the territorial legislature was petitioned to establish a road from Madison to the rapids on the Baraboo River. This was one of the first times we see the name Baraboo in the newspaper. In April, the legislature appointed commissioners to lay out a road from Madison, quote, "running on the most eligible route to the rapids of the Baraboo River in Sauk County, known as Rowan's Rapids." Even with government-sanctioned roads, conditions would still be bad for many years. A trip over the bluffs in 1849 was described by Eliza Chapman. "When we reached the Baraboo Bluffs, with only hickory poles along the sides of the wagon box for springs, we thought riding rather vigorous exercise, so we walked most of the way. I'll not attempt to describe the road, as imagination might run away with the facts." Accommodations for those trying to get to Baraboo were also often memorable. Maria Remington described her journey from Milwaukee to Baraboo in 1850. "The third night was one of horror, and though groundless, none the less real. We had been driving for hours through a desolate country without sign of human habitation, when we came upon a low, lonesome-looking cabin. Impelled by necessity, we requested shelter, and we were grudgingly admitted. The distance from civilization, the gloomy surroundings, the miserable buildings, and the forbidding aspect of our hostess prevented sleep or rest. Through the long, sleepless hours I started at every sound. Imagine my feelings when the door of my room softly opened and stealthy steps approached my bed. I lay speechless with terror until I recognized in the intruder my hostess, who drew from the larder under my bed a piece of bacon and withdrew to prepare our early breakfast. I dressed hurriedly in the gray light of dawn and went outdoors to find my driver already harnessing his horse, as anxious as I to leave the desolate place. Organized religion was brought with the Yankee settlers, although it took many years for it to flourish. In 1841, the first religious service in the Baraboo Valley was conducted by a Reverend Fullerton, a circuit rider who rode from Prairie du Sac to the Baraboo Mills to preach to 11 people. Though slow, the population of predominantly Yankee settlers in the Baraboo Valley continued to grow. On July 15, 1842, Sheriff A. Byrd of Dane County finished a census of the inhabitants of Sauk County as instructed by the territorial legislature. Sheriff Byrd counted 393 people in the county, although we know today some people are missing from his count. 132 people were listed in the Baraboo precinct, which included all of northern Sauk County. One couple that was among those enumerated was William and Cordelia Canfield, who had just arrived from upstate New York and settled on Skillet Creek. William Canfield soon became Sauk County's first surveyor, and more importantly for us, Sauk County's first historian. Education was usually not far behind organized religion. Eben Peck persuaded a man named E.M. Hart in 1843 to teach school in a log cabin for $25 a month. This is an indication that there were enough children now in the river valley to call for such measures. Meanwhile, as more people populated Prairie du Sac, residents there once again petitioned the territorial legislature, this time to fully organize Sauk County and sanction the start of a county government. This was against the wishes of some residents in the Baraboo Valley who believed there were not yet enough people to populate a jury list or to start a county government. Nonetheless, on January 10, 1844, an act was passed with Sauk County scheduled to be organized on March 11, 1844. Before county government could start, one of the most important decisions to be made was where the county seat would be located. The act of the territorial legislature called for 3 commissioners from outside of Sauk County to come to the area and make the decision. The 3 men were instructed to meet at the house of William Hubbard in Prairie du Sac prior to April 1st and, quote, make a careful examination of said county, having regard to the present and probable future population of said county, and to locate the seat of justice thereof, where in their opinion it will be for the best interest of the county. The commissioners waited until early March to do their work. The trio surveyed Prairie du Sac and neighboring Haratsi, today Sauk City, and took a quick visit to the Baraboo Valley, but apparently did not even cross to the north side of the river. While visiting the area, they came to William Canfield's settlement on Skillet Creek. One of the commissioners died near there of a stroke, leaving the other 2 to finish their work on the selection of the county seat. Back at Prairie du Sac and Haratsi, the contest for the county seat had turned into a bidding war between the 2 villages to see which one would offer the county government more free land to be sold to raise money with which to build a courthouse. William Hubbard offered 47 lots in Prairie du Sac to the county. The village of Haratsi offered a seemingly better deal in the way of lots and a new 2-story building that could be used immediately as a courthouse. With the decision still to be made, on March 11, 1844, Sauk County government was officially born. Elections were held that day for county officers at the house of William Hubbard in Prairie du Sac, and James Webster in the Baraboo precinct. 3 county board commissioners were elected: John Hoover and William Simons from the Sauk Prairie area, and Levi Moore from the Baraboo Valley. "19 days later, Prairie du Sac was awarded the prize of becoming the county seat. What many people did not immediately know is that the day before, Hubbard had amended the offer of land with a clause that if county seat were ever to be moved from Prairie du Sac, the price of the lots that had been sold would be refunded to him, and any unsold lots would also be returned. The next day, John Hoover was elected the first chairman of the county board. On the 3rd day of county business, thoughts turned toward the construction of a county courthouse. A resolution was passed by a 2-to-1 vote to build a good, substantial frame building 20 by 30 feet, 2 stories high on the public square of the county seat as now located. The lone no vote came from Levi Moore, the commissioner from the Baraboo precinct. Right from the start, Moore consistently voted to hamper the development of Prairie du Sac as the county seat. Those who lost the bid for the county seat did not lose quietly, especially those people from the Baraboo Valley. Just 16 days after Sauk County government started, a mass meeting was held at the home of Prescott Brigham out on the Sauk Prairie. About 80 people were present, and a formal complaint was drafted alleging that the commissioners who located the county seat were not impartial and that a referendum should be held to let the people decide where the county seat should be. The reversionary clause of the Prairie du Sac lots was also a very sore point. In a war of words that ensued in the Madison newspaper, the proponents from Prairie du Sac contested that it was the agitators that originally wanted the commissioners to locate the county seat in the first place, instead of having a referendum on the matter, because they thought they would lose to Prairie du Sac. The parties from Prairie du Sac offered to remove the land revision clause, but it was of no use. The wheels were set in motion. Back over the bluff, George Brown of Whitewater came to the Baraboo Valley in June of 1844 to look things over. Brown surveyed and claimed a stretch of rapids along the Baraboo River that he knew would make a good water power. Later that summer, Brown's brother, brother-in-law, and others moved on to the claim. Members of Brown's party probably just missed seeing the flood of July 2nd, 1844, which wreaked havoc on the Baraboo Valley's only dam and sawmill at the Upper Oxbow. Canfield later wrote, "We had a great freshet, one of the greatest, probably, that has ever been on this river. It carried off Wood and Rowan's sawmill and part of the dam. The small creeks were out of their banks and some 2 feet on the bottoms. The Baraboo was also over its banks. There was a man drowned in going down the river on a raft of lumber. The ground was so completely saturated with water that the ground squirrels were to be seen crawling around, every hair of them wet, as easily caught as a toad." After things subsided, Wood and Rowan made new plans to rebuild their operation. Shortly after the flood, Yankee ideals were once again expressed when the Baraboo Total Abstinence Society was formed. The catalyst for the group was the death of an alcoholic man in the area. There were no liquor licenses at the time, so anyone was free to sell alcohol. Many people then in the Baraboo Valley signed the pledge stating that they believed, quote, that the drinking of ardent spirits and all fermented liquors as a common beverage to be not only useless but hurtful to health, and that they would only use it for medicinal or mechanical purposes. That year, the settlers in the Baraboo also got around to building the first schoolhouse in the Baraboo Valley. It was a log building which today would be roughly on 7th Avenue between Birch and West Streets. It was a crude, low affair, and someone reported that you could throw a cat through the cracks without touching a hair. There were no desks. The teachers and students sat on slab wood benches, and there was one blackboard which was 2.5 by 5 feet. In the fall of 1844, Wood and Rowan came up with a new scheme for their operation at the Upper Oxbow. They would build a dam on the west side of the Oxbow and dig a channel or race for the water across the peninsula of land inside the Oxbow. This would ultimately create more water by having the water fall a greater distance. By the following summer, the new dam and sawmill were completed. The first marriage of settlers in the Baraboo Valley occurred in November of 1844 when Erastus Langdon married Martha Brown, sister of George Brown. It was a memorable evening not only because of the wedding, but also because there was an eclipse of the moon that night, and during the occasion, news finally reached the community that James Polk had been elected president 2 weeks earlier. Shortly after the wedding of his sister, George Brown's dam and sawmill on the south side of the river were completed. The mill, however, was not to Brown's liking, so the following spring he built a new one. While excavating for the new mill, the skeleton of an entire woolly mammoth was discovered. Unfortunately, it slowly crumbled after being exposed to air. In May of 1845, news about copper and other resources along the Baraboo River started getting circulated and picked up in eastern newspapers in places like North Carolina, Ohio, and New York City. These continued throughout the year of 1845. That fall, Sauk County's first courthouse was finished in Prairie du Sac. County officials had been meeting in private homes before that. The upstairs of the new courthouse contained the courtroom, while the first floor had offices for the clerk of the county board, clerk of court, and register of deeds. The first county board meeting was held in the building on October 6, 1845. The building added some seeming permanence to the county seat at Prairie du Sac, but the fight was far from over. The completion of the building, no doubt, reignited the issue. On January 8, 1846, a petition signed by 182 county residents to change the location of the county seat was presented to the territorial legislature. By February, their petition was granted, and the legislature passed an act authorizing an April referendum on the location of the county seat. The legislature also spelled out several conditions that had to be met if the voters decided to move the county seat from Prairie du Sac. This included a provision that all unsold county lots in the village were to be given back to their donors, and donors of lots already sold by the county were to be paid for them. The public square and the courthouse were to be given to School District Number 1, and suitable new buildings would also have to be erected at the new county seat before a move could officially take place. On April 7, 1846, a majority of the eligible male voters voted in favor of moving the county seat to the southeast quarter of Section 35, Town 12 North, Range 6 East, a location on the north bank of the Baraboo River at a point midway between the two oxbows. At the next meeting of the county board, the commissioners ordered deeds to be issued, relinquishing title to lands donated to the county, and that the original owners of lots in Prairie du Sac already sold by the county to be issued refunds. The following day, the clerk of the board was instructed to write the register of land at Mineral Point and ask for instructions on how to entitle the land on the Baraboo River for the county. A reply from the land office indicated that $200 would be required to secure the land for the county. The board ordered that the money be borrowed as there were no funds available from the county treasury, especially after the reimbursement of landowners in Prairie du Sac. Because there were no banks yet in the county, the money would have to be borrowed from an individual. County Commissioner Prescott Brigham entered into an agreement with Sauk County, loaning the $200 needed at an interest rate of 12%. Shortly before the referendum, the Baraboo area witnessed something incredible as later recounted by William Canfield. We were visited by a flock of pigeons, the magnitude of which was almost beyond conception. From noon until night, the heavens were darkened by the immense flocks as they passed over. They seemed to be lighting a little south of us. In company with others, I went to see them. When we got within a quarter of a mile of the Skillet Creek on the west road, we began to hear them, and when across on the south side of the creek, we saw one of the most wonderful sights I ever beheld. It was now night, but the moon gave full its usual quantity of soft, pale light. Every twig, even to the tops of the trees, could be seen, but as we approached them, it seemed as though we were entering a heavy piece of hemlock woods or some underground passage. The noise made by their twittering was so deafening that it was difficult to be heard, except as we were close to each other and spoke in a very loud tone. We could hear trees fall and branches break on every side of us, so heavily were they loaded. And when they thus broke or fell, the noise made by their raising sounded like the heavy distant thunder. I think no one who saw the rookery would disagree with me in saying that there was enough to cover the surface of the ground 1 or perhaps 2 feet deep. This will serve to give something of an idea of the magnitude of the flock. We concluded it would be a difficult matter to raise any crop or live in company with them. They had got possession and could not be driven off. But on the 10th, 9 days from their first appearance, there came one of those general storms that sweep from the Atlantic through the northern states and down to the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. The snow fell that night about a foot deep and continued following until the next day. The next morning the snow was all gone, and so were the pigeons. Sometime in 1846, the first bridge across the Baraboo River was built near George Brown's claim. It was built of rough round logs and was known as a crib bridge, with piles of crisscross logs as supports. It spanned the river where the current ash walnut strip bridge is today. In April of 1847, the county board ordered that the new county seat be platted. Prescott Brigham was given the honors of choosing the name as he had loaned the money to Sauk County to purchase the land. Brigham chose the name Adams out of respect for the former president and his family. Adams was laid out around a central public square with 66-foot wide streets, except for Broadway, which would be 100 feet wide. East and West Streets marked the respective edges of the plat. At the same time, George Brown also had a smaller village platted, which he named Baraboo. The plat encompassed his dam and mill improvements on the river and extended up the hill to the south. The two plats actually touched just north of the river and would later be combined. Today, the two original plats of Baraboo and Adams are still the center of the city. Adams was platted in an oak opening. These openings occurred throughout the county and consisted of open, meadow-like areas with mature oak trees, including bur, white, and black oak, dotting the landscape and sometimes producing small groves. This habitat did not occur naturally, but was maintained by fire as indigenous people burned off areas to prevent growth of unwanted trees and shrubs. Burning helped keep the landscape open for hunting and encouraged the growth of edible fruits such as berries and acorns. The area of the public square was one such opening. A dense grove of trees grew to the west of the square and also to the east past East Street. The south side of the river was largely wooded with sugar maple, oak, elm, ash, ironwood, and butternut trees, which had to be cleared for building. The public square sat on a slight prominence of land, with the highest part running through the middle north to south. On the southeast corner of the square was a large swampy area that was eventually filled in. A pond and marshy area also existed at the corner of Oak and Fifth, with a dry creek bed that headed southeast. An ancient trail cut across the square from the southeast corner to the northeast corner and continued west on 4th Avenue until it reached the river and turned north. Sauk County began selling lots in the new county seat on May of 1847. Choice lots on the square were sold at the rate of $7 per lot, except for the corners, which sold for $10. The rest of the lots in the plat were sold for $5 apiece. The clerk of the board was instructed to advertise the sale in Madison newspapers, which he did along with an announcement soliciting bids for the construction of a frame courthouse, which was to be 24 by 36 feet and 2 stories high. Edward Summer and James Maxwell purchased the entire block east of the square. Maxwell proceeded at once to build the first frame structure north of the river at the northeast corner of 3rd and Oak Streets for use as a store. Sumner decided to build a hotel just north of Maxwell's store at the southeast corner of 4th and Oak and named it the Adams House after the village. The initial public sale of county lots was followed by several more running into 1848, eventually netting the county close to $4,000, which provided the funds for the construction of county buildings. Besides building the first store in downtown Adams, James Maxwell also secured the rights to the water power at the lower Oxbow and began building a new dam there. Edward Sumner was awarded the contract in July of 1847 to build the new wood frame courthouse for Sauk County at a cost of $575. Unlike in Prairie du Sac, the courthouse was built on the north side of the square, leaving the center of the square open for a future brick building. Later that year, James Christie was awarded the contract to build a log jail. The building would sit near the courthouse on the north side of the square. This would be Sauk County's first jail, and it turned out to be very easy to break out of. One early inmate was Abe Wood, yes, that Abe Wood, who then, when inebriated, was a terror. During one stay in the lockup, Wood simply lifted the boards and dug his way out. Sauk County's first courthouse sat on the north side of the square, roughly where the Square Tavern sits today. By the fall of 1847, Adams was beginning to get noticed. The Wisconsin Express newspaper in Madison noted, "Here everything was life and energy. We found a grist mill in full operation and 4 sawmills on the river and 2 in progress of completion. About 20 buildings have been completed at this place and several in progress. It has a hydraulic power equal to that of Watertown, and a country well supplied with timber of the best quality. The Baraboo country is well calculated for farming purposes, consisting of prairie and woodlands." The community was dealt a blow in December of 1847 when George Brown, the founder of Baraboo proper, was killed during the construction of an addition to his flour mill. A bent, or series of timber framing, fell on him, crushing his head. He died a few hours later in his rocking chair at the age of 27. His funeral would be the first held in the courthouse, which was still under construction. The territorial census of 1847 counted 2,177 people in the whole county, with 955 of those in the Baraboo precinct. The county board met for the first time in the new courthouse in February of 1848. Levi Griswold was engaged to build 12 wooden benches, each with a back, for $1.25 apiece. The building was used not only by the county government, but also as a schoolhouse, church meeting house, and dance hall. With much confusion with the two names of Adams and Baraboo, and given the fact that there were plenty of other communities across the country also named Adams, in early 1849 the county board ordered that the plats of Adams and Baraboo be combined and called Brooklyn. This unpopular move lasted only for a short time as the Baraboo name grew in popularity. In the late summer of 1849, a committee was appointed by the county board to oversee construction of brick fireproof offices next to the courthouse in order to comply with new state laws. A one-story brick building was built to the west of the courthouse, which provided offices for the clerk of the county board, clerk of court, register of deeds, and county treasurer. The building appears in one photograph of Fourth Avenue, taken in 1915, shortly before it would be obscured by the construction of the Al Ringling Theater. An article in the Buffalo Morning Express in October of 1849 described Adams as having about 500 residents and 125 buildings, none of which was a church. There were members of the clergy, though, men like Methodist minister Warren Cochran, who had arrived that year, hoping to make Baraboo a quiet, New England-like village. To that end, the Methodists built the first church building in Baraboo, which was 34 by 36 feet in size and built of wood, with sawdust filling the walls for insulation. The building was located at the southeast corner of Broadway and Fifth Streets. The Congregationalists followed, building their first building in 1852 at the southwest corner of Oak and Second. The square had substantial improvements in 1850 with the construction of 4 two-story buildings on the south side of the square by John Taylor, and aptly known as Taylor's Row. Taylor rented out the buildings he didn't use himself and built them all in the Greek Revival style. While 2 of the 4 buildings were later destroyed by fire, 2 lasted well into the 20th century. And one still survives today. It is by far the oldest building on the square and one of the oldest buildings in Baraboo. On the north side of the square, Michael Connell built a 2-story brick tavern and hotel just west of the courthouse. The building would be enlarged twice and later become known as the Wisconsin House. It lasted well into the 20th century. It would also be part of one of Baraboo's most famous riots just a few years after it was built. With the community growing in population almost daily, the Sauk County Standard newspaper was started in one of Taylor's buildings and distributed its first issue on June 25, 1850. In the paper's earliest issues, calls were made to protect the native trees on the public square from being ruined by being used as hitching posts. The mature trees were prized for their shade and were in danger of being killed by girdling, which happened after the repeated abrasion caused by tying animals to them. Indeed, one early resident said, "There were no restrictions of any kind. Cattle and horses were wont to graze along our streets. nor was a big fat porker an unfamiliar figure. The square truly was a public space used by many for many things. In May of 1853, the newspaper reported that 21 wagons filled with immigrant families from Indiana were parked on the square on their way to the headwaters of the Baraboo River. The Ho-Chunk also used the square as a place to spread out their trade goods, camping for a week or more and dancing and singing until the early morning hours. Residential architecture took a huge step forward in 1850 when David Noyes had a two-story brick residence built overlooking the river near Ash Street. The building was designed by architect Walter Pashley in the neoclassical style. The bricks were made locally, but the two-story columns must have been imported at great expense. Lumber continued to be Baraboo's top export for many years, with thousands of logs coming down the Baraboo River. Most of these logs had to pass over the dam at the fledgling village of Reedsburg upriver. In the spring of 1851, the owner of the dam and namesake of the town, David C. Reed, refused to let logs go over his dam because of the damage it would cause. Reed also owned a sawmill and hoped to be paid to cut the logs, and Reed also probably knew that many of the logs had been cut illegally on federal-owned land. Whatever his motives, Reed's actions enraged the lumberjacks who wanted the logs to pass and the sawmill owners in Baraboo that wanted to cut them into lumber. After refusing the demands from Baraboo, Reed sent a man to Milwaukee to carry a complaint to the U.S. Marshal, and a deputy marshal was sent to Reedsburg to settle the matter. With the wisdom of Solomon, the deputy marshal seized all of the logs held at Reedsburg as the property of the United States and ordered that they be floated down river to be sold at Baraboo. The affair came to be known as the Saw Log War, and Reedsburg came to be seen as something of a threat to the county seat. Things were starting to boom in Baraboo, but the county board had yet to make plans to build a brick courthouse, a move which would make the county seat a more permanent thing. Several more years would pass before anything was done, however. As the community flourished despite the inaction of the county board, new industries were started, including a pottery factory. The venture was started by English immigrant Philip Poynton, just a few blocks from the square, and the pottery works produced stoneware jugs, crocks, and other items. It became successful enough to keep 2 wagons busy delivering pottery to surrounding communities. The pottery works was sold by the Poyntons in 1856 and burned in 1857. It was never rebuilt. Thousands of pieces of broken pottery were found in 2021, buried in a Baraboo backyard where the pottery factory once existed. The legacy of George Brown was further sullied after his death when the grist mill that he had constructed was destroyed by fire in October of 1852. The prime location, however, did not sit idle for very long. By 1853, the county had still done nothing about building a new courthouse. Fed up, Charles Armstrong, state assemblyman representing Sauk County, petitioned the state Supreme Court to issue a writ of mandamus against the county board for the deplorable condition of the county buildings and for the board's inaction on building a new courthouse and jail. His petition was granted and the county board was served. However, the move had little effect. These were days when sometimes you had to take matters into your own hands. In May of 1854, this happened quite literally when on a Tuesday morning at 10 a.m., 50 to 60 women gathered on the square to rid the town of all of its liquor, encouraged some days before by the words of Reverend Warren Cochran. The women started with the Brick Tavern on the north side of the square, which was promptly emptied of its ale, beer, wine, and hard liquor in a matter of minutes, despite the protest and physical attacks of the owner and his wife. All of the liquor bottles and kegs were smashed in the street. The women proceeded to empty other grocery stores and taverns of their liquor until a near riot broke out at the tavern of French Pete, and the sheriff finally showed up and intervened. Several of the women were later arrested and their husbands fined. The county board finally voted to build a new brick courthouse in the center of the square in December of 1854. Financing would be shared with the town of Baraboo paying $2,500 and Sauk County $1,500. As with all brick buildings in the community, the 160,000 bricks needed for the project would have to be made locally. This significantly slowed down construction. The building was built by contractor and entrepreneur Patrick A. Bassett. Bassett would become one of Baraboo's richest men through his various enterprises, and one of these was a new flour mill. In 1855, Bassett and J.P. Sanford purchased from the estate of George Brown the waterpower that he had developed and commenced building a large and elegant mill at the site. The flour mill originally had 4 grindstones, but soon 2 more were added. Bassett did a very large and liberal flouring business. Most of the wheat of Sauk Prairie was hauled over the bluffs to Bassett's mills. The road to the railroad 14 miles distant at Kilbourne soon became dotted with teams delivering flour for export. As barrels for his flour were hard to come by, Bassett later added a cooperage to his business, with 15 to 30 coopers making barrels for his operation and for others. He eventually supplied all the mills within a circuit of 50 miles with barrels. Stores and shops continued to fill in around the square and its side streets. On Oak Street, J.R. Davis opened a store and named it after his home state. This picture of the establishment is the oldest known picture of downtown Baraboo. The new brick courthouse was finally accepted in January of 1857, although 2 porticos with stone columns were yet to be completed. The building featured a cupola with glass windows on top. A year after the courthouse was finished, the county's new stone jail was also completed. The building was built as a hexagon, with each side being 24 feet in length. The roof was topped with a skylight to provide light to the interior. The jail housed not only the prisoners, but also the sheriff and his family. The building was accepted by the county from the builders only after a change was ordered to have holes cut through the cell doors to allow dinner to be served. The building sat where the current Baraboo Post Office is today. With the courthouse and jail finished, efforts were made to clear the courthouse square of its decidedly superfluous rubbish, grade it, make walks upon it, seed it down, and adorn it with shade trees. Diligence was required to keep the grounds looking their best. The Baraboo Republic lamented in 1864 that the courthouse trees were being ruined by cattle that made their way onto the grounds when careless visitors to the courthouse failed to close the gates of the fence. After the square became more manicured, it was often used as the place where large public picnics were held, with temporary tables of rough-sawn lumber being set up to hold the bounty of food prepared. In 1851, nearly 300 children, under the direction of the superintendents of the public and private schools, gathered on the square and waded through numerous readings and addresses before being allowed to descend on a 50-foot table covered in cakes, fruits, and sweet meats. In the early years, the square was never perhaps more so the county's front yard than on the 4th of July. If public activities for the 4th were not planned, sometimes the young men of the city took matters into their own hands, creating bonfires with anything that could be found around the square that wasn't nailed down, including lumber, barrels, and crates. This often resulted in spoiling a large patch of grass. One such flammable pile was said to be the size of a 1-story house before being set ablaze. During the July 4th festivities of 1859, the roof of the new courthouse caught fire from celebratory fireworks. The blaze was extinguished only when a willing volunteer managed to get a bucket of lemonade up onto the roof. After the county vacated the old wood courthouse, it was sold. For a time, the second floor became the newspaper office, but later it was sold and moved several yards to the east. A new front was put on it, and it was turned into a tavern. It was not to suffer this indignation for long. The building burned during the early morning hours of July 5th, 1859, as did other buildings over the years during the night of July 4th to 5th, largely due to fireworks. The paper lamented the loss of the noble building. It was then turned into a saloon, and no doubt what was left of the old courthouse felt the degradation deeply, but it was not long to endure the humiliation. The fire came, and the flames seethed, hissed, and roared in, around, and about it, and cleansed it of all its impurities, and its ashes sank to earth as pure as nature herself. This concludes Baraboo 101 Part 2. We encourage you to check out Baraboo 101 Part 3, which will be available on the SHS YouTube channel.